Good afternoon, everybody. It is 2:00. I'm Michael Cook. I'm the chair of the West Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Technical Advisory Committee. And I co-chair this meeting with my counterpart in East Turlock GSA, Sarah Walk. I know we do have enough members for a quorum, so I'm calling the West Turlock GSA to order. Sarah, would you like to do the same thing?
Yes, I would. We have a quorum as well, so we'll call the East Turlock GSA to order.
Wonderful. So I noticed a few new faces in the room and online. So let's do a round of introductions, starting with
Jennifer Land, Turlock Irrigation District.
I'm Michael Cook. I'm with Turlock Irrigation District.
Nicole Chance, Merced Irrigation District.
Matt Beeman, Merced Irrigation District.
I'm Christine McKinnon with Stanislaus County.
Dennis Jotillo, Belico Cortez.
Len Mason, Formation Environmental.
Mike Tietze, the GSA coordinator.
Sarah Wolf, Eastside Water District.
Lacey McBride, Merced County. Our council, East Turlock.
Miguel Alvarez, City Modesto.
And Barahona, City Modesto.
Angelica Gonzalez, City of Ceres.
Neil Reyes, City of Houston. Leandro Maldonado, Delhi County Water District. Michael Clipper, TID.
Mike Pittock, City Waterford, representing Hickman.
Maggie Curtin, TID. Debbie Montalbano, TID.
Well, welcome, everybody. Our first item on the agenda, number 3, is public participation. This is the time set aside for members of the public to directly address the GSAs or the tax of the GSAs on any item of interest to the public that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the technical advisory committees. And you can speak now on any matter of general interest, or if you want to speak on an agenda item, speak when that item is up for discussion. So with that, I'll open up public participation. Do we have anyone who wants to speak? Okay, seeing no one in the room and seeing no one online wishing to speak, we'll move on to item number 4, which is the adoption of the minutes from the last meeting. These are, I'm sorry. Hold on a second. Okay, these were, geez. These were distributed earlier in the week. These are the minutes for the June 13th, 2023 regular joint meeting of the and Turlock Technical Advisory Committees. So with that, the West Turlock GSA, would anybody like to make a motion to approve those minutes or suggest modifications?
I'll move.
Okay, Leandro moved. Do we have a second?
I will second.
Second from Ceres. Do we have any further discussion? Okay, they'll call for the vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, those minutes stand approved. Over to you, Sarah.
I'll need the same from East Turlock GSA. Can I get a motion to approve our minutes from the June 13th meeting?
I can make the motion.
Christie, and a second.
Second.
Lacey, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you.
Wonderful. Moving on to item number 5, budget update. This is an overview of the revenues and expenditures for the West Turlock and East Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agencies. So we'll start with Michael Clipper with the West Turlock and the overall basin account.
Okay. Balance for West Turlock account for 7/31 was $493,743.33. The basin account was $903,309.04. Any questions?
Michael? Hey. We'll get both accounts.
What?
Do we have any cash flows coming up or we've been out for those?
Yeah, I think I need to double check, but I think I have the invoices. I need to send out the invoices.
Okay, right, because all the cities are flush with money right now.
Yeah.
Just been approved, so let's get those invoices out before they spend it. Okay, sounds good. And then Sarah, or
Sure, I can give a quick account balance for ETS GSA today is $576,761.57.
good. We're going to, I think, later on, we're going to talk about some of the projects we'll be working on this year. So we'll soon be working our way through those monies. Okay, moving on to item number 6, on-call consultant services. This is just a discussion matter, or it's actually an action regarding the need and timing for on-call services with Todd Groundwater managing the GSA's Sigma implementation. So is that Debbie?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. So over from time to time, there is a need to work with Todd Groundwater on a variety of items that are not specifically project related. So historically, we've had a small contract in place to pay for their time to do those things. And an example of that would be a recent meeting that we had with the Delta Mendota consultants on wells along the rivers, coordinating where the wells would be placed so that we could have wells on either side of the river to be able to monitor surface water and groundwater interaction and what's happening between the subbasins, which is a requirement of SGMA. And so the time spent in the conversation with them on the phone or on the Zoom call would be billed to this on-call services type of a contract. And so I think that conversation earlier this week expended the last of the on-call services contract that we've had in place. The costs over the last couple of years have averaged about $5,000 a year or something like that. So it's not a huge budget item, but it allows us to interact with Todd Groundwater on non-specific items. In this particular instance, we're asking for a budget that is slightly higher, and we put it in the budget to be a little higher because of the recognition that the GSP is currently being evaluated by DWR, and we expect to hear something back from them by sometime in January, maybe sooner. They may have questions that come up, and that would enable us to work with Todd Groundwater and the consultant team in addressing questions on a more expeditious basis rather than waiting and then having to somehow go get a contract in order to be able to have the conversation. You know, it moves things along. And so that's why we were asking for a contract price of about $15,000, which is what was put in the West Turlock budget. I think East Turlock is budgeting slightly differently, but they have a potential action item on the agenda for today as well. To be able to move the contracting process forward. So for West Turlock, the technical advisory committee, if an item's been budgeted, and this one has, the technical advisory committee is authorized to be able to move that contracting forward and then, you know, update our board on where we are with all of that. And so that is kind of on the agenda for a potential action item should the technical advisory committee of the West Turlock wish to do that. I think East Turlock is moving through a different way, and so it's worded slightly differently for them. But that's kind of the item before you is to at least for West Turlock to authorize moving forward with that. For East Turlock, I think the wording says to recommend that the GSA agree to fund the cost share. And so I'll open it up to any questions. If there are any or possible action should the technical advisory committees wish to.
So Debbie, if I can just address this real quickly from the East Turlock Subbasin viewpoint, it's intended to add operational flexibility to be able to tap into Todd Groundwater on an as-needed basis. As items come up, if there is a possibility to pick up the phone and collaborate together before implementing it, we would do that. And what East Turlock, what we're asking the TAC to consider for East Turlock Subbasin is to make a recommendation to the board to allow staff to utilize Todd Groundwater as necessary, and then that would be paid for in our budget under prudent reserve. It's a fairly nominal charge So we didn't include it as a formal line item in our fiscal year 23-24 budget. As it comes up, this is an appropriate kind of thing to be covering under prudent reserve. So that's what we're proposing and what we're asking, what I'm asking the TAC to recommend to our board for approval.
Mike, for that. Do you have questions for Mike or Sarah? So for the West Turlock folks, just a reminder that the board adopted the budget and also an agreement for consulting services, but wanted to put kind of a check and balance approach in so that as we moved ahead with those individual actions to implement various phases of our GSP implementation, that would get reviewed by the West Turlock Technical Advisory Committee, not just me as the chair, just sign off on contracts independently without any other sets of eyes looking at, what we were doing at the work plan and making sure it's consistent with the budget and consistent with the GSP. This is just a step in the process. The money's been budgeted, concept's been approved. Now this is just the GSP allowing this contract or this portion of the contract to move ahead. So any questions for me on that one? It's a slightly different process, that's all. Because our board meets so infrequently, it's like if we have to go back to the board every time for an agreement, it would be a cumbersome process and would delay implementation of the GSP.
I had one more item or one more thing, clarification, just so everyone is aware. We would, so if there's just a conversation that needs to be had with Todd Groundwater, that wouldn't be coordinated between the two GSAs specifically and approved, because it's maybe our conversation as opposed to if there is a work that's needed to address questions from DWR on the GSP, that would be coordinated on a more specific basis before that work would be done under the contract. So there's some controls over how this kind of on-call services is used. So it's used frugally, so to speak. If that answers any questions that you might have with respect to that.
Any other questions on this item? Seen a bit online with a hand up. So with that, for the West Turlock folks, this is a motion to recommend that these,
First action is for East Turlock.
right, sorry, the first actions for Easter. I apologize. Go ahead. Yeah.
And just for the East, I think important to remember, we did review this in our budget process, but just identified that we would be pulling from prudent reserves because we anticipate the expenses most being used for responses to DWR. And so it has been identified that we would need to use that from prudent reserves if it comes to pass that we need to use it. So with that, can I get a motion from East Turlock to recommend this budget item or to sign a contract, rather to sign a contract with Todd?
I'll make the motion.
Thank you. Second.
I'll second.
Thank you, Dennis. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Wonderful. So for the West Turlock GSA TAC, we have authorization to contract with Todd Groundwater for on-call services to be jointly funded by the GSAs and up to $15,000. Get a motion to that effect.
Motion.
Okay, so motion, do we have a second? Second by Modesto. Any further discussion? For those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, motion stands approved. Thank you. Okay, moving on to item number 7. This is the authorized use of the groundwater model. This is a discussion item regarding the proposed data disclaimer and authorized use of the Turlock Subbasin groundwater model by other public water agencies within the Turlock Subbasin. With that, I'd like to hand over to Valerie. Okay.
Sure thing. Hopefully my face is giant in that room right now. Okay, so I think the document I assume that you guys have is a resolution followed by an exhibit A data release disclaimer. And I will speak kind of at a high level if anyone has specific, questions on phrasing or concerns about specific language, please feel free to ask. But the idea here is that, we've used this groundwater model for the basis of the GSP that we sent to DWR, and that we are relying on, obviously, as a subbasin to get us to the next level, and hopefully pass at the DWR stage. So the concept is that we are fine, and obviously this is for your consideration. I'm not saying this, but we need to consider, are we okay allowing folks to use that model with some disclaimers? One is that it's not perfect. Two is that it's not meant to be an adjudicative tool. And by that, I mean, figure out specific water rates or water claims in the basin. And then three, this kind of a little bit of a controlling factor on who we're giving it to. If someone takes the model and either changes inputs or uses it in a way that significantly undermines the data that the GSP is built on, the concept is, we'd like the model to be used for other processes, and if you find there are errors in it, to work collaboratively, so we don't have someone using the model in a way that becomes a problem for the GSP or the basin. So that's really the purpose. Is the disclaimer says basically, we'll take it, we can't guarantee anything, and we understand whoever is receiving the requesting agency understands, how this was built, the purpose for which it's being used, and that they'll continue to collaborate with the subbasin if there are changes or errors. That we'll talk about that, frankly, kind of internally with the two GSAs, rather than toss up red flags or do our kind of dirty laundry out in public. So it's a little bit controlling, but a little bit of a safety mechanism, and that's the purpose. I will tell you that other basins have kind of crossed the same concept of, we want to have individual members use the model, but we don't want people to use it in a way that undermines the data that we've collaborated on and the GSP that we have submitted to DWR. So I'm happy to stop there if folks have questions or thoughts either about the concept or the way that it's a resolution and then a disclaimer that will be used to any requesting party. I'm happy to take those on.
Okay, thanks for Valerie. Do you have questions for Valerie? Just so you know, full disclosure, one of the entities looking to use this model is Turlock Irrigation District. For a couple of reasons, a couple of projects I'm working on. We're going through the relicensing of Don Pedro Dam and Reservoir right now. As part of that, we're working with the State Water Board and others on effectively how much water we'll have to leave in the river for aquatic purposes, and which will affect the amount of water we can divert for irrigation purposes. And so I'm trying to run various scenarios of, if we reduce the amount of water we can divert for surface water irrigation, what would the impact be on the aquifer? So a good example of what we're trying to use it for. One of the other projects we're working on is during certain water years, like last year, there's an amount of water in the Tuolumne that no one has claimed. So certain flood waters basically that no downstream diverter or appropriator has claimed. And TID and MID have filed an application over a year ago to take some of that flood water when it's available in those fairly infrequent years when it's available. So we won't be able to run scenarios if we can divert water during those big water year types and apply it to land. What would the impact be? What would the positive impact be on the subbasin, on the aquifer, those things? So agencies like TID could get access to the model and run scenarios to see groundwater impacts. And again, as Valerie mentioned, we have to make sure that we run the model, faithfully, so we don't come up with inputs that contradict what's in the GSP. And I imagine too, some of the urban agencies could get access to the model to look at, I forgot what it is. I think it's SB 640 water supply guarantees type stuff. Before you do development, you have to show you have enough water available. Would you have to run a model scenario, see if the groundwater impacts? I don't know, but it's something that could be available. And I don't know, Mike and Sarah, whether there's plans in East Turlock GSA to get access to the model to look at various things. I don't know, but it'll be available to everybody. Any questions on that item? It's just, it's not an action item if I remember correctly, but we will be taking this to the West Turlock board. and then subsequently hope to the East Turlock Board. So these resolutions get adopted, the disclaimer gets approved, and so that then we can feel confident providing the model to others to use and making sure it remains faithful to its original intent and outcomes.
So two questions that I can think of. The first is in the the whereas statements, the preambles. Should we consider potential future updates to the model so that we don't have to revisit this resolution or sharing after sharing of the model, for example, prior to the 5-year GSP updates and so forth? I mean, perhaps this should refer to whatever is the latest version of the model. And then the second question is the agreement is focused on member agencies that contributed to the development of the model. And that seems fair, but is that something that we would consider broadening for educational or other public agency sponsored uses of the model? Or are we simply reserving the right to confer on that kind of a request before granting it?
That's a great question, Mike. But Valerie, anybody has a thought on that one?
Yeah, no, the first comment's good, and I like the forward thinking. Assuming that new changes to the model wouldn't affect, both of the GSA's willingness to release it. I think that's a great idea. And then you don't have to redo it. I think we can probably put language in that captures that concept. Any future iterations of the model, we can kind of define that as the C2 vSIM TM. And then when we short cite it, we can kind of capture it that way. So I think that's a great idea. On the limitation of the member agencies, that was purposeful, but that was, that's kind of a question for the GSAs. Do you want that to be, I put it in there purposefully to be a limiting factor, but that's certainly a question that you guys can ask. And if you want to broaden it or have it released further, we can change the language to do that. But I think that's, kind of a policy call. So if anyone else has thoughts on that, on changing it, the language would be easy, but I did limit it purposely.
I'm not advocating one way or the other, Valerie. I just bring it up because there's a team from UC Davis and the USDA that is working on developing a model for our subbasin that had asked if this model would be available for them to glean information from it for their efforts. So, the question is already on the table. And I guess, the question to the East Turlock and perhaps the West Turlock TAC would be, do we want to broaden this at this point for those kinds of educational uses? Or do you want to maybe not cover that in this agreement so that any requests like that get discussed separately as part of the due diligence for reviewing those requests?
I would prefer due diligence coming back to the boards on those types of requests so that there's a mutual understanding of what the outcome is intended to be of those requests and agreement on that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Just like I think USDA presented here, like even group before even asked for the model, just come in and talk about what they're looking at research in our area. I think that's always good practice for all of us to know what's going on. And at that time, they say we want to study this and you need a copy of the model. Maybe we'll authorize that too at the same time. That makes a lot of sense, Sarah.
From a practical perspective, if both GSAs are going to be approving a similar type of resolution, is there a need to have something in it to talk about one GSA letting the other GSA know whom they've authorized to do, and have like a central point of knowing that so that there's no question about kind of where it is and who's got access to what and just from an accounting perspective.
Good point, Debbie.
And I think one thing that we had discussed briefly was that, let's say a member agency wants to use the model. Should the GSAs be given the opportunity to, to weigh in on the actual changes and use of that model within the Turlock Subbasin? And I don't think that the intention would be to make the process more complicated or more onerous than it needs to be. But it seems like it's that might be an appropriate at least thing to put on the table and consider that perhaps the GSAs should be given the opportunity to weigh in on the uses.
Like the reason they need the model, like weigh in to say whether we think you should use the model for that or that.
So no, not so much that as, for example, the use of the model that you're describing that refers to surface groundwater interaction is of interest to both GSAs. And so since it's of interest to both GSAs, it might be of interest to both GSAs to be aware of the technical development of the model and to be given an opportunity to comment. And I don't think it needs to be something really formal or intensive, but I do think that let's say, for example, that ETS GSA decided to use the model to assess what's the interflow across the GSA boundaries and the interaction between the eastern principal aquifer and the upper and lower western principal aquifers. That's a use of the model that we might be interested, I'm speaking theoretically here, in championing to answer some of our questions in the future, but it's something in which WTS GSA would have great interest. And I would anticipate inviting WTS GSA to the table to provide input to the development of that model use. And I guess the question would be, is that something that we want to formalize in an agreement like this, or is it just something that we want to approach on a case-by-case basis? I wanted to put that on the table for technical discussion.
So my understanding of the agreement is for a member agency to use a model. The GSAs already have the right to use the model. So if East Turlock GSA was doing that, they'd be subject to this agreement. I wouldn't think. It's just part of GSP implementation. Now, if Belico Cortez wanted to do that, that'll be a little bit different. So I hate to be nuanced, but that's what I'm trying to get to here. That's the crux of the agreement, is for a member agency, not the GSAs. That makes sense? I think there's, as part of GSP implementation, we work together anyway. Like I said, there's a GSP issues, right, that we need to work on together and like going on, all that stuff. I think that's our normal course of business of implementing the GSP. When TID, in my case, wants to use the model for its own individual project that's kind of separate from the GSP, that's what this agreement's for. I don't know if I'm making sense. Mike.
Yeah, and that's the nature of my question.
Right.
So I mean, to just kind of maybe bring it down into the real question. ETS GSA would be interested in TID's use of the model for the purpose that you're describing, and we'd like to have the opportunity to participate in the technical review and comment on that model, not to hinder the process, but to help the process. And if that were possible, there would be one of two ways to do it. One would be that we contemplate that kind of engagement as part of this agreement. And the other would be just a completely separate discussion with TID. Hey, we're interested in this. Can we be invited to be included in some fashion in how it's being applied? And then TID could either respond yes or no, depending on its purposes. Because the question really is, does that become part of this agreement or is that a separate conversation?
Well, I guess my initial reaction is that'll be a separate conversation because TID's analysis would be more than just what's going on with the model, right? And I think this is, I guess I'm trying to keep this narrowly focused on someone using the model, taking those files and using the model. I think there's a whole other conversation potentially with TID taking floodwater about where does the conveyance go? Where does the recharge go? Where's the best place to do that? I think that's where we have that broader conversation with East Turlock folks. This is the larger program, not just the running of the model. That's kind of a small component of a larger program.
So what you're proposing is that there could be a separate discussion to determine whether or not a GSA is a stakeholder in a particular process, and that conversation should naturally occur along separate lines and run its course.
Yes. Because a project is normally just more than running the model. I mean, I don't know what others think, but, and this is me spitballing right here.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think that the model is going to be an informational component to whatever project you're working on. And in this instance, ETS GSA may or may not be part of that larger project discussion.
And I can't, well, here's my thing. On that specific project, so if you look at the application itself, it's for beneficial uses, I think in a 3 or 4 county area, right? It doesn't discriminate to certain areas. So you already have indirectly a larger stakeholder group. You have those conversations. So I think that's TID. I sense that's TID's position anyway. It's a collaborative effort. It's not a TID effort. Now, that's not to say, and I can't think of one. Is there a project down the line that's strictly a TID type thing? I don't know. I haven't thought of one yet, but I'm not saying that it could never happen. But generally, I think what the district's goal with some of its projects is what can we do for the region, not just for TID.
I mean, since I brought up the question, I'll just speak to that makes sense to me. To approach it that way, that a project agency proponent should determine who the stakeholders are and what its stakeholder processes are for use of the model, and that maybe does not need to be addressed in this agreement.
Right. I think for you guys, I mean, and I'm just getting carried away now, but you're looking at a project way up in Snelling, probably not that interested. But if you're looking at that interface between the 2 GSAs, then we would be a stakeholder.
Yeah.
So I don't want to automatically be a stakeholder on every single project when really we don't, common sense says we don't need to be. Okay, that was fun. Working hard on an afternoon. Any other questions, any thoughts? And again, we put together this draft, we did email it out. We'll take a final version to, at least for the West Turlock board for adoption. But again, this is just for your consideration or input before we take it to the board. And I know I've made some notes, but Jennifer, you make way better notes. There were some suggestions that language changes before we take it to the board. I think they were good, particularly Mike had the initial recital about future updates.
Right.
What else did you have?
I think that's it in the sake of what changes need to be made more immediately. There was just the other conversation of which you and Mike just had in detail regarding any concurrence or conversation that you have regarding collaboration between the agencies that want to use the model. But otherwise, I don't think there are any other recommendations to make changes. But if there are, we're happy to review those and consider incorporating.
Right, we mentioned the idea of including public agencies. We decided, well, it's not public agencies, but research institutions saying that let's not do that right now. But as they come up on a case by case basis, we'll put them through the process. So,
Debbie also noted, I'm sorry, about the GSAs notifying the other of who has been granted use. So is that something that we want to consider?
It's very possible we would forget what you granted use to, so it might be good to just keep a
right,
refresher with.
it's good practice to have that in there.
Okay.
So really, then it's the two changes, in the recitals, talking about the future updates or the most current version. And also something in the disclaimers or wherever that we notify each other agencies or other groups who provided the model to. Val, did you get that stuff?
Yep, I think that'll be easy to do. The whereas will be easy. We can either put. We can probably put is that the whole structure of this is that someone signs it as a requesting agency. It's not like a contract. But maybe the idea is that we provide the data release disclaimer. If either of the GSAs get one of these disclaimers and provide the model, we'll send it over to the other GSA.
Sounds good. Okay,
And then will both those ETS-GSA and WTS-GSA will get the final version sent to us, I'm assuming.
yes. Same version, and we'll both slap our own ideally identical resolution on the top. So we'll have the same thing, kind of like when we adopted. It's a joint meeting, but this will be separate meetings, but the general idea.
And West Turlock is proposing to take this to our board next Thursday, the 17th. So we should have all the additional information incorporated and more of a final version available to you within that time frame.
And our next board meeting will be the 26th of August.
Okay.
To do it after.
Perfect.
Okay, any further discussion on that item? Okay, hearing none, well, thank you, Valerie.
Sure.
Moving on to item number 8. This is the round 2 multi-benefit land repurposing program grant. A status briefing by Mike Titza. So over to you, Mike.
So Jennifer, I think you have the slide deck. It's just the first 3 slides that I'm interested in. So I want to update you on next steps. Now this first slide, I should say this is still a tentative schedule. This could slip depending on how long it takes to engage and finalize a grant agreement with the Department of Conservation. But we've been in contact with them and we do expect to get a draft agreement from them later this month to begin talking about developing a final agreement. We have been reaching out to our agency partners to start having conversations with them about next steps and roles and responsibilities and what they would like to see. And then we've begun preparing a project execution plan that we will finalize in coordination with finalizing the grant agreement. In September or after those initial steps, we'll finalize the grant agreement and the project execution plan because those will have the scope, schedule, and budget and all the roles and communications and file management and so forth all spelled out. We'll enter into agreements and MOUs with our partner agencies to engage them in the work. And then we'll have a kickoff and planning meeting with our partner agencies. And then after that, in October, we tentatively plan to begin developing of the MLRP plan that will govern the program. And again, this is a block grant program, so we have a plan that identifies where our best opportunities are and our framework for evaluating and scoring, ranking, and awarding grants that would be funded by Department of Conservation to various different applicants. And just as an aside, this particular grant program, it allows upfront payment of funds so that we don't have maybe as many cash flow issues as some other grant programs. So in October, begin developing the MLRP plan, develop an outreach and engagement plan, conduct disadvantaged community outreach to begin understanding what their potential, concerns and aspirations are relative to multi-benefit land repurposing, and conduct tribal outreach to engage them. And that's something that's been important for the state, but it's been difficult in some cases for the state to figure out how to engage the tribes in a meaningful way. So the next slide just gives an overview of the org chart, and this is a good opportunity to talk a little bit about roles and expectations. So the program management role would fall to ETS GSA, supported by a program management consultant. We haven't decided who that is yet, but one proposal that's on the table is to have Formation Environmental do that. Len, recently got his MBA in some work that's similar to this kind of work, and so we want somebody to manage the overall program. The steering committee that would consider that would make recommendations regarding the adoption of our plan and would consider applications for block grants would be Stanislaus County, Merced County, and self-help enterprises to represent the disadvantaged communities at that level. And then the executive committee that makes the final approvals would consist of ETS GSA and WTS GSA. Program administration and finance would be the responsibility of ETS GSA, supported by the program management consultant. The plan development, and this is something I want to put out as a question to the tax. We see that as essentially being a land use planning activity. So getting a planning consultant, a land use planning CEQA type multidisciplinary consultant on board to put this kind of plan together seems appropriate to us. So we would propose and when I say us, I'm not speaking for the TAC, I'm speaking for GSA staff. So this is a proposal to be discussed by the TACs. Specifically, how do you view potentially bringing a planning consultant on to manage the process of a multidisciplinary team developing this land use and multi-benefit land repurposing grant? It would be supported by various technical staff, sustainable conservation. Turlock Irrigation District would have input regarding flood management benefits, as well as solar target areas and areas where it wouldn't be as favorable to develop solar. And then engineering consultants as necessary. So this would be a multidisciplinary team. Grower outreach and engagement, once we have the plan together, the RCDs, East Merced RCD, East Stanislaus RCD, and as supported by California Farmland Trust, would perform grower outreach and engagement and education so that they could develop proposals to take to the steering committee for land repurposing and for evaluation and ranking for potential funding. The DAC outreach and engagement would be self-help enterprises and the counties. Permitting and construction, ETS GSA would act as the lead agency, but the program management consultant and the planning consultant would support CEQA NEPA and permitting. We believe that our PEIR, this could be the first use of our PEIR on a lot of these projects to make the CEQA compliance of land repurposing more streamlined. I think it's ideally suited to that. And then monitoring and support. Finally, this is the long-term monitoring to make sure that the acres that are planned for repurposing are actually being repurposed and maintained in the long term, and verifying the various benefits that accrue to that repurposing. So there would be a consultant involved in that, and the RCDs would be involved in Any questions or comments on those roles or responsibilities? Do you see it differently? Would you advise us to explore other options? What do you all think about the idea of a planning consultant heading up the MLRP?
I think it's very comprehensive, and I appreciate the way you brought in a DAC there from self-help enterprises to help with the DAC stuff. I think it's fantastic. I think the land use planning is a good idea. I just wondered, is there any role for like economist or something like that to look at, because some of these decisions are going to be ultimately, I think, business decisions for the growers. And I've got 2 tomato plants, so my experience is pretty limited, but and they're dying.
Contract.
Oh, stupid fruit won't turn red. It's so. But I mean, that's often it's this kind of lines crossed where how much land can I follow or can I repurpose, and what does that mean economically? And is there a role for someone like that as part of that team?
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent comment. And let me just say too, that, I'm bringing this up, right? This is not your last opportunity to comment on this. I think it's going to be a considered process before we finalize this. This is really a preliminary look from our application as to how the roles and responsibilities are going to be defined in the plan that we develop. So economics it's an excellent idea, I think, to include that in the MLRP plan development for sure. I mean, do you foresee that being in other areas as well? I think primarily it would be the plan development.
And you already got us up there, but if you're developing solar or something like that, I mean, I don't know if all of this is actually in TID's electrical service area. Some of it may be in PG&E's.
Some of it's in PG&E.
Yeah, they would know that stuff, so.
I wonder in your plan development if the RCDs, maybe like a dotted line to the RCDs, because they might have some tools or processes in place that you could pull into your plan that you don't have to recreate the wheel for some best management kind of practices on purchasing, habitat restoration, things like that the RCDs might know.
Yeah, we've already, in fact, had conversations that, while the RCDs would have primary responsibility for grower outreach and engagement and education, that they would have a key role in the MLRP plan development. And likewise, sustainable conservation would have a primary role in the plan development and would have a secondary role in the grower outreach and engagement. So we're already starting to have those kinds of conversations. Are there any, well, let me maybe save that last question. Just put a question on the table and you can answer it after the next slide. Recommendations or direction from either TAC as to, next steps to best capture a plan forward. One thing that we had talked about was putting together an ad hoc group to help steer this. And I think that ad hoc group should have representatives of both TACs on it. Or meetings. Okay, next slide. So this just kind of gives you an overview of the types of approaches that we're thinking of. This is not intended to be exhaustive. The size of the icon in each box is intended to be proportional to the size of the benefit. And you can see that the biggest benefits that we envision in terms of multiple benefits of different project concepts are orchard swale rewilding, floodplain reconnection, cover cropping, habitat restoration and rewilding, and recharge or storage base. And we see that there are recharge benefits, decreased demand as areas are taken out of crop production. Water quality improvement benefits, habitat benefits of various sizes, flood flow retention benefits. They all provide climate change resilience by making agriculture more resilient in their area. They do provide disadvantaged community benefits, some more than others. Now we'll need the DACs to weigh in on that, but I think not only does everyone benefit from a more resilient agricultural community in terms of what does agriculture look like in a post-Sigma environment, helping to answer that question. But in some cases, I think quality of living is improved by some of these concepts. And then sustainable agriculture. Again, we want to be asking the question of ourselves and of others, what does sustainable agriculture really look like in the post-Sigma environment? Help to answer that question. We've been talking about most of this land repurposing would likely occur on the east side. But then we looked at, well, wait a minute. There are things that we could do that would benefit the west side as well, not from a standpoint of like a land repurposing or retirement program, because that's not necessary on the west side. But if you think of things such as the water quality benefits of cover cropping, as well as the water quantity benefits of cover cropping, it might be ideal to identify parcels on the west side that need water quality benefits because of issues surrounding the new nitrate program. And that's something that could be explored under this grant program. So I just want to put on the table there that I think everything can be considered, and that I don't see the benefits primarily accruing to ETS GSA, but to both ETS GSA and WTS GSA for the benefit of all. So there's things that fit in both sides. Any questions or comments or recommendations for how best to move forward?
Getting excited. Your floodplain reconnection, have you looked at any particular locations? Is it the Merced, Tuolumne, both, either?
What we've considered was the small local creeks, but it could extend into the Merced, the Tuolumne, or there's already floodplain reconnection projects on the San Joaquin, but it could include the big rivers as well as the smaller local streams. What we've suggested was that for the smaller local streams, using beaver dam analogs that are relatively low impact, low cost to implement, low cost to replace if they needed to be maintained, and yet they would retain and spread flood water in an area that would help both recharge and habitat and flood attenuation. And then lastly, of course, we've got Lacey here, and we've already been talking about collaborating with Merced on approaches, thinking about how we do that in developing an MLRP plan, that it should have a section regarding interagency collaboration, and how we best benefit from the best ideas that happen in either block grant area. And we already have an inquiry from another block grant recipient that wants to talk to both of us about, sharing lessons and collaborating on lessons learned. So hopefully this will build some excitement. I'd like to propose that, that we consider having some more focused discussions on ideas as they come up, so that we can implement a program that, kind of takes us to the next level. What does this really look like in the post-Sigma environment? And how can our region, our region's agricultural community best benefit from the land repurposing that has to take place? How do we make it more beneficial and less painful?
hopefully the plan that's developed here will help then feed into the GSP when it gets updated in a few years and provide meaningful projects and other things as it moves forward.
That's good. Thanks, Mike. Any more questions for Mike? Well, thanks, Mike and Sarah well, congratulations on the grant award and in the ground running and moving ahead. It's very exciting for our region. So thanks for doing that.
I just wanted to note, there was a message in the chat that it didn't look like some of the slides were appearing properly, and so my apologies. This will be posted on the Turlock Groundwater website following the meeting. So you are welcome to visit the site and review the information then, or I'm happy to send it out for anyone that didn't get an opportunity to see the information. And again, my apologies.
Technical gremlins. Okay, moving on to item number 9, Sigma related updates. This is where we do info share on items of mutual interest related to Sigma or other groundwater items. So I have a standing list here. Is this you, Debbie?
Yes, partially anyway.
Okay.
I do have some updates. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about kind of where we are and where we're going for this year. Let's see. The first item I wanted to talk about is the grants that we've been working on over the past several years. Those grants have been officially completed. We received the pension back from the Department of Water Resources. And as a part of that, they also review the GSAs and how we conducted the grants. And so they did give us the highest score we could get, which I was pleased with, because that hopefully will help us as we move forward in applying for future funding. You know, they always take a look back and see how you did last time, and if there were problems, then that might, be a deterrent. So hopefully it'll help us get a few more extra next time. So we'll see. With respect to the grant application that we submitted back in November, I think I reported at the last meeting that we provided comments on their draft recommendations. And we haven't heard anything back since then. They haven't notified anyone of final recommendations or anything like that. So I would assume that they're still in the process of reviewing things, but we'll report back as soon as we hear anything. I'm hopeful that they'll at least consider the comments, because I don't believe that our application was reviewed correctly in the way it was analyzed. And so hopefully that gives us an opportunity to score a little more, and maybe we get into the funding, but only time will tell. So any questions on the grants? And I'll move on. Okay. We do have, if you could pull up, I have a slide to share, just as a way of talking through what the West Turlock's budget and product that were identified as we developed the budget were, and then talk about where we are with all of that and what the plan is moving forward. So this shows the budget that we put together for this year that started in July. I think Michael Clipper is going to be invoicing everyone on this. So so expect that soon. In the meantime, I've been working through kind of developing scopes of work and that sort of thing, and you'll be seeing those in the coming months. So the first item I wanted to talk a little bit about is the well. So that's at the bottom, where we budgeted about $250,000 this year for well installations. As everyone knows, we've got a lot of monitoring wells to install. we included that in the grant that we applied for in November. And if we do get funding for that, then that'll be reimbursable. So know that, but we've been budgeting for the past 3 years for well installations. And so now we're stepping back and looking at the wells that were designed with the Prop 68 funding, and locations and everything, and cost estimates, and seeing what we think we might be able to install with the funding that we've been accumulating over the past few years. We want to get wells in the ground so that we can begin monitoring those water levels. And there's a lot of one of the data gaps that we identified as we developed the GSP is that we don't have monitoring wells, dedicated monitoring wells that are able to show the water levels in both the upper and the lower aquifer. And so that would be the focus for West Turlock this year. It would be to try to install as many of those wells as we can. We want to wait on the river wells until the Department of Water Resources issues a guidance document that should be forthcoming. We thought it would be later this fall, but it might be in the springtime. And so we want to wait until that guidance document comes out before we consider installing wells along the rivers. So that, you know, if they say, well, really, we want multi-completion wells there, we're ready to do that, as opposed to installing something and then having to go back and do something else. So that's why my thought is to focus on the internal within West Turlock wells for the time being. And so my plan is to bring something back to this group next month, kind of the plan moving forward, and then, you know, facilitate the process for going out to bid and what have you. And then it would come back to the tax and the GSA to get approval to move forward with contracting. But I just want to give everybody heads up that we're actively working on that. And I'll be bringing some recommendations to you with respect to that. But the hope is to do that work this year and to get wells in the ground so we can begin monitoring. So any questions on that? Okay. We also had a conversation with the Delta Mendota folks. I think I mentioned that earlier this week, and they have 3 wells that are planned along the San Joaquin River, and those areas are very close to the locations that we've identified in the monitoring plan that was developed through Prop 68 as well. So we're continue to coordinate with them as we move forward with the river wells, but they have one that's funded under a grant this year that they're planning to install near I think it's Patterson, the Patterson Bridge. And so we'll continue to coordinate with them as they move forward with that. And then a couple other things I wanted to talk about. If you could go back to sorry, Jennifer. Thank you. So the other items that we have put budget is obviously the annual report. We're going to be working on a scope of work to bring back to this group for that. That's an annual project, and the water level analyses, there is a scope of work that has been circulated to a smaller group, and for doing the analyses of the water levels for spring and fall, spring of last year, or no, fall of last year, spring of this year, to then feed into the annual report for 2023. And once I have feedback from, I think I forwarded it on to Mike and Sarah, and they're working on those. I can then send it to the group for any final comments. We received approval from this group to contract for that, budgeted costs for that back in May, but we were waiting for funding for this fiscal year to move that forward. So if I could get some feedback on that, then we'll move that project along. I talked to Todd Groundwater, and they're ready to move that work along once we've gotten approvals and we can do the contracting. So I don't know if there's any thoughts on that or timing for East Turlock. I know there was a fiscal issue last year when we sent that around in May. You remember?
You might have to resend it to us. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that there was a timing issue around from our budgetary perspective was the installation of the river wells. And I think, the timing is such that, the funds for implementing that would be available from ETS GSA near the end of our fiscal year. And it sounds like that's going to coincide very well with the guidance that's coming out from DWR as far as implementing the other management activities that we're going to be collaborating on. There's no limitation. I think we should move forward as planned.
Okay, so I'll resend that scope of work to you. I think I did earlier last week, but I'll do it again and make sure that, yeah, because I'm kind of holding on that and I'd like to move it forward. And that item will also kind of folds into the minimum threshold exceedance plan that was budgeted for last year, and we've have a draft. I think Todd Groundwater gave a presentation on that in May or June. Was it June? I don't recall. I think it was June. Yeah. And so what my plan is moving forward with that is we haven't gotten any comments on that. If there are any comments, please let me know. Once we have the review of the water levels from last fall and this past spring, we can use that data along with the previous year's data to kind of evaluate how that plan would be implemented as we gather water level measurements, and so we can kind of see how it's working and make any adjustments that might be needed and then finalize it. And so they kind of work together in tandem, as I'm seeing it anyway, unless others have different thoughts. That's kind of my approach as I was moving forward with it. So, so that ties those together. I am working with Todd Groundwater on the drinking water mitigation scope. So I plan to bring that to the group soon as well. I should have a draft from Todd Groundwater in a couple weeks, and I'll circulate it to a smaller group and get some feedback, and then we'll bring it to the larger group if that's all right with everyone. So that's moving forward. We have some funding for the empty exceedance implementation if there's a need to do anything there. We have funding to work on the GSP if it's required to update. We won't know that until the Department of Water Resources comes and provides some feedback on our GSP. So that one's kind of on hold. We're also working on, there's a need to update the minimum thresholds on the west side. And so I have a draft scope of work to work on that as well. That's related to the MTs being established based on historic water levels, where on the western side of our basin, water levels have been extremely high. And drainage pumping has had been done to lower groundwater levels there. And so in some cases, the difference between the MT and the MO, or the measurable objective, is less than 10 feet. Less than 5 feet in some instances. It's not really an operable range. And we knew that as we went into it, but we wanted to establish all of the sustainable management criteria consistently throughout the subbasin. And so we recognize that as an item to address as we move forward with the GSP. And so I have a scope of work that I'll be sharing on how do we go about that, you know, and so expect that soon. And then you just took action on the on-call services. I believe the intent, and there's some funding for outreach and interbasin coordination as needed. The data management system, or the DMS, I think in coordinating with East Turlock, the idea on that one is to wait until next year, perhaps, as it's not absolutely kind of essential. We do have a data management system that is meeting the need for the subbasin at this time. The intent for that option was to move it forward so that we have a more robust data management system that would meet the need for the subbasin moving forward, and begin, you know, kind of looking at that and figuring out the best approach. But at this point in time, that one's kind of on hold. So I wanted to make everyone aware of that. And yeah, so that's where we are with the different projects for this year. I know it's a lot, but I wanted to give everybody kind of what to expect and what to see in the coming as we meet and move some of these projects forward. Questions?
Questions for Debbie? Useful West Rock and maybe East Rock is our budget for the year, is our work plan for the year. And obviously East Rock's also been very busy with the multi-purpose thing. And so Jennifer, this information will be on the website. Maybe also look at the projects and the budgets, what we do so over the year and kind of keep us all on track. But please stay engaged. I know there's a lot of changing faces in the group, but there's things we have to do and work on collaboratively. So stay engaged, in touch. Don't be frightened to reach out. And we're always better together. So let's keep working together on these things. Debbie, just DWR just approved our plan. Last 5 minutes.
No, actually, I think Valerie was going to talk a little bit about kind of where they are with
Statewide.
Yeah, statewide, if she's still there.
Yep, I'm still here. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can, Val.
Great. You scared me, Michael. I definitely was like, did that really just happen? So DWR has been working hard over the past 2 weeks. They've approved about 15 plans. That brings the approval or recommended for approval number to 40 subbasins. And there are 43 subbasins that remain in progress, in review. So we are in that group of 43. Sorry, there's a ambulance going by. There are 6 inadequate basins. So you've got 40 approved, 43 still in progress, and 6 inadequate basins. The inadequate basins are in this process of transitioning an intervention over to the State Water Board. It has been, frankly, a fairly difficult process. The State Water Board has had 2 workshops, but has yet to, and did not adopt regulations about how that relationship, that pass off from DWR to the State Water Board would go. There's certainly more questions than answers for those subbasins right now. And, you know, frankly, they find themselves heading to probation or at least a probationary hearing with very little information about how that will go. So again, the State Water Board did have 2 workshops. One was really preliminary. The second workshop on June 21st was more helpful. They did provide an order of inadequate subbasins. Tulare Lake is going first, Cooley's second, Kauai's third, Delta Mendota or Kern is fourth, Delta Mendota and Chowchilla are the last basins. My understanding is that Delta Mendota and Chowchilla are both have either close to revised or for Chowchilla revised plans. And it sounds like they, the State Water Board, at least staff, has a pretty good sense that those folks may not have to go to the probationary hearing. They may get a second review and get back over to DWR before those hearings start. But there's kind of general consensus that the first 4 subbasins are likely headed to this probationary hearing. There's going to be a draft staff report, and there are going to be stakeholder workshops. But again, there's an aqua group kind of coalescing and working and trying to question the State Water Board staff about what the process is for getting back out of intervention before probation to DWR. And largely State Water Board staff keeps kind of saying, we don't really know what that process is. There are several questions about probation as well, what the threshold is for that hearing. What happens if you're designated is more clear. All of these subbasins are steering the change from local control to State Water Board control if they go to probation. And of course, on the ground, that means that each individual well owner would have to report to the State Water Board and pay fees. So it's a really big shift. I know in the workshop, the State Water Board kind of glossed over that shift and said, it's not really until we draft an interim plan that we take over, but I'm not sure the GSAs see it the same way. So, just a lot of confusion, a lot of nervous folks in that small group of 6 subbasins facing that inadequate. And of course, testing kind of this enforcement component of SGMA for the first time. So, obviously Turlock is one of the 43 subbasins remaining to be determined. And that's a lot of work. Remember that the 40 basins that they've approved, they started rolling those out in June of 22. So we only have a couple months left to do 43 subbasins. So, if you're a numbers person, I hope we get done by, January of 24, but we'll have to wait and see. So that's a pretty high level overview. Debbie, I'm happy to kind of drill down on I don't know every single subbasin, but I'm happy to take any questions about the process or what different folks are doing if people want more information.
Any questions for Valerie? I think they should just approve all the ones that are left.
Okay,
Agreed.
fingers crossed, fingers crossed.
My wife's a high school teacher. I've seen her grade. She gets like. Late on. Okay. Thank you, Valerie. That's very helpful.
Yep.
Yeah, so any other updates from anybody over here? Water levels coming up, pressures are up. Water quality is improving. All that stuff, no? Okay. We're working towards it. All right, with that, our next meeting is Tuesday, September 12th at 2 p.m. in this room. And sending out information for that meeting. Again, the presentations from today are on the website. If you need more information, just follow up there. With that, from the West Turlock folks, I'll take a motion for adjournment at 3:18. Motion from Miguel, we have a second. I'll second. Leandro, all those in favor signify by saying aye. The West Turlock is adjourned at 3:19. Over to you, Sarah.
I'd like to make one correction. I had mentioned our next ETS GSA board meeting is the 26th, it's actually the 24th.
Okay.
So just wanted to give you that correction, and then I look for a motion.
There.
Okay.
For us.
Second. All those in favor? Aye. Aye. 3:19, we are adjourned.